Good morning and welcome to the Family Caregiver Education Series. I'm Debbie Emerson, Hope Hospice's community health educator. I'm also certified by the Alzheimer's Association as a dementia specialist. And in addition to my professional training, I've been a family caregiver to loved ones with dementia. And I'm going to be using some of those personal experiences to illustrate some of the content that we're going to be presenting today. And now I'd like to introduce my co-presenter, Gia Barcel.
Thanks, Debbie. I am Hope Hospice's Manager of Dementia Services and Community Education. I am a TIPA SNO certified trainer and advanced consultant. So my job is to help educate families and care providers who are navigating dementia, as well as help come up with non-pharmacological ways of working through behaviors. Our goal is to create an environment where we have a care team in place that supports everyone involved to the best of their abilities. Quality person-centered care is our goal. As well as doing these educational seminars with Debbie and in the community, we also can help come up with plans for individual care. I look forward to talking with you today, and my hope is that you will learn some things that are helpful to you on your journey.
All right, our next Family Caregiver webinar is going to be on October 12th. Julie Fiedler, an attorney from Horizon Elder Law, will do a presentation about what we need to do to get legal and financial affairs in order for ourselves and also for those for whom we provide care. Julie is an elder law specialist and a registered nurse, and she has been kind enough to share her knowledge and expertise with us over the last 8 years. Our November webinar features a presenter from Alameda County's Health Insurance Counseling and Advocacy Program. Jenny Pardini, HICAP's Director of Community Education, will bring us the latest information about Medicare and Medi-Cal, which is California's version of Medicaid. It seems like there's changes every year, and it is so important for us to stay informed. By the way, Medi-Cal has actually changed its asset limitations this year. It's going to make it much easier to qualify. Jenny's going to be able to give all of us the latest info. And as always, you can register for our webinars on the Hope Hospice website under Events and Resources, Family Caregiver Education Series. And by the way, we have just posted we've just completed coming up with our 2024 schedule of classes. And we've got 7 brand new classes. Now, we'll talk more about those at the end of the session today.
We've also got recordings of our previous webinars available to you on our website, including the dementia topics that are listed on your screen. So today our topic is Dementia Basics. This class is from our Living with Dementia series. Last month, we did a presentation that looked at the differences between typical age-related changes, mild cognitive impairment, and dementia. And if you missed that presentation, like I mentioned a second ago, you can view it on our website at hopehospice.com, and I encourage you to do that. It's a really great session. Our goal today is to do just what the title suggests, provide you with foundational information about dementia. We'll cover basic facts about dementia and the underlying causes. We'll take a look at how the brain changes and how these changes impact thinking and behavior. And we'll go over the stages of dementia to give you a better understanding about how this condition typically progresses. As Debbie mentioned, if you've got any questions as we're going along, write them in the Q&A box or jot them down, and we'll address them either after the break or at the end of the webinar. And we'll be taking a 5-minute break about midway through.
Okay, so how do we define dementia? What is it? So I'd like to begin with what dementia is not. Serious memory loss is not a normal part of the aging process, even though sometimes it seems like it is. And if you joined our August webinar, we took a thorough look at what typical age-related changes do look like. Since memory issues are generally the first to occur with many dementias, we tend to think that dementia is only a memory condition. However, as we're going to see in just a minute, dementia actually impacts several other important brain functions. Now, I always tell people don't get too excited when they see the not always permanent bullet point. Most of the underlying conditions and diseases that cause dementia, such as Alzheimer's, are permanent. But we'll take a look in a moment at what other things might be responsible for temporary dementia-like symptoms. Now, it's only natural to think that Alzheimer's and dementia are one and the same, since the majority of cases of dementia are caused by Alzheimer's disease. And much of the information we know about dementia was based on research conducted on patients with Alzheimer's. However, as we're going to see shortly, there are many other underlying causes of dementia symptoms. And dementia is not a standalone diagnosis. It's not a disease, even though most people, including physicians, tend to use the term that way. Dementia is always caused by something else. If someone exhibits symptoms of dementia, such as memory loss, language issues, confusion, we need to know what might be causing those symptoms. In other words, what's the underlying condition? And we especially need to be able to rule out if these symptoms are being caused by something that's treatable. So dementia itself is not a disease. So what is it? This is the definition of dementia that we'll be using today. Dementia is a group of symptoms or a syndrome that indicates a progressive decline in cognitive functioning and behavioral abilities that have a significant impact on daily life. So the word cognition refers to anything having to do with our thinking, our thought processing. It includes memory, communication skills, problem solving, reasoning, and understanding cause and effect. And we'll talk about all of these and more later today. Now, behavior is what the person does. For example, a person living with dementia may wander and become lost. They may do things that are out of character for them. They may become suspicious or accusatory. They may withdraw socially. And we'll talk a bit more about these behaviors today, but our December class is going to go into much more detail about dementia-related behaviors. Ultimately, the person living with dementia will lose their ability to function independently. So to review, what does it mean when we say someone has dementia? We mean that the person is exhibiting symptoms of cognitive and behavioral decline that reflect a change in what we usually expect from that person and that are negatively affecting the person's life. So looking at memory issues, a difficulty speaking and understanding what's being said to them. They may easily get confused, may have difficulty with solving problems or making decisions. They may be unable to focus, may get easily distracted. Now remember, we're looking at changes from their typical behavior. For example, I have always had a problem staying on task. I tend to flit from one thing to another, but I'm always able to finish my tasks. Now, it might drive other people crazy, but that's just how I function, and I've learned to make it work for me. Now, as dementia progresses, we may see increased agitation or even verbal or physical aggression. Repetitive behaviors, wandering, possibly paranoia, and social withdrawal or isolation. And again, we'll talk more about these later in the presentation. And very importantly, there is some underlying condition or disease that's causing this syndrome, this group of symptoms that we know as dementia. Now, earlier, I got everybody excited, I'm assuming, by saying that there are some things that some causes of dementia-like symptoms that are not permanent. So let's take a look. There are many conditions that can cause confusion, memory loss, disorientation, even hallucinations, things that may appear to be what we think of as dementia. But, and it's a big but, if it can be reversed, it's not technically dementia. Now, some of these can be referred to as pseudo-dementias, or the medical term delirium. If the cause is discovered early enough, these conditions are generally reversible with appropriate treatment. So some examples, adverse reactions or side effects to certain medications or combinations of certain meds can cause cognitive impairment. For example, if you've ever had general anesthesia, as you're regaining consciousness, you may have experienced delusions, maybe even hallucinations, disorientation, confusion, and short-term memory loss. Now, as you know, this will go away once the anesthetics have left your system. Now, this is the reason that your physician tells you not to drive or sign any important papers for at least 24 hours after surgery, even outpatient surgery. Now, one of the links on your online resource list provides details on some common medications that can cause dementia-like symptoms. The good news, usually when the medication's discontinued or the dosage is changed, the symptoms are going to disappear. We may look at infections such as Lyme disease, syphilis, pneumonia. They can all produce delirium. The high fevers that typically accompany one of these serious infections can cause that disorientation, confusion, even hallucinations. Now, common among the elderly are urinary tract infections. And especially among the elderly, the first indicators of a UTI may be confusion and disorientation. Once these infections are under control, usually with antibiotics, the dementia-like symptoms should disappear. We always knew when my mom had a UTI because her dementia symptoms would suddenly get much worse. Now, metabolic disturbances include things like electrolyte imbalances. It's caused by dehydration. Dehydration, really common in the elderly. They tend not to drink enough water throughout the day. Low blood sugar can also be common. Both of these conditions, left untreated, can cause severe confusion and disorientation. Once treated, the symptoms should disappear. Now, with nutritional deficiencies, we're looking primarily at B vitamins, sodium, and potassium. If an elderly person shows signs of lethargy, confusion, disorientation, you may want to ask their doc for a blood test to determine if there's a vitamin or a mineral deficiency, because both can produce dementia-like symptoms. Or if somebody is already diagnosed with dementia, these deficiencies can cause the symptoms to worsen suddenly. By the way, this does not mean that we should all go out and take massive doses of vitamins and minerals. That could actually be harmful to our health. So it's really important to determine that a deficiency does exist, and typically that's done by a blood test. Now, is the fact that someone is not processing newly acquired information due to vision or hearing loss? We can't remember or understand information that we didn't see or hear in the first place. So before we jump to the conclusion that our parents or spouses are not remembering what we told them, let's be sure they're hearing us in the first place. Emotional distress caused by major life changes, such as the loss of a loved one, or even a major move, or unrelenting, unmanaged stress, kind of like a lot of us are experiencing these days. You know, with so much going on in the world right now, politically and environmentally and all that other stuff, I know that I have been extra forgetful and sometimes even a bit disoriented as a result of all of this. And then that makes me even less able to focus on tasks. Two very close friends have recently lost their husbands, and I keep reassuring them that they don't have Alzheimer's, but that they're suffering from grief dementia. It's a real thing, and it's very common. And the more we worry about things, the worse it gets. Just like grief and emotional distress can cause memory loss and behavioral changes, so can chronic pain. Now, our brains prioritize survival. So in the case of grief or chronic pain, much of our cognitive energy is devoted towards doing what we need to do to manage the pain or manage the grief. And as a result, memory for everyday stuff may be lost in the shuffle. So it's important to remember, if someone shows sudden signs of memory loss, confusion, disorientation, or any other behavioral change, first always check for another cause before jumping to the conclusion that they're developing one of the diseases or underlying conditions that does cause dementia, like Alzheimer's. So I thought I would insert this little video at this point. We're always being asked, Jay and I, what's the difference between dementia and Alzheimer's? So I found this really short little video from Trinity College in Dublin, Ireland. So we've got some accents going on here. It does a really nice job of explaining the differences, and it's going to give us a quick little preview of what we're going to be talking about in greater detail later on today. And I do have the link to this on your resource list, just in case you want to watch it again or share it with someone else.
What's the difference between Alzheimer's disease and dementia? Perhaps you've been confused by these terms in the past, or mistakenly thought they were the same thing. Well, you wouldn't be alone, because knowing the difference between Alzheimer's disease and dementia can be tricky. But it's actually not too hard to understand. In a nutshell, it's like the difference between shortness of breath and asthma. Shortness of breath is not a specific disease. It can have many different causes, and asthma is just one of them. Likewise, dementia is not one specific disease. It's a combination of symptoms that has many different causes, including Alzheimer's disease. Still sound a bit confusing? Okay, think of it like this. You go to your doctor with shortness of breath. Find the cause. She listens to your chest to see if it's due to asthma or pneumonia. And then she checks your heart to see if your breathlessness is caused by heart failure or a very rapid heartbeat. She even asks if you've been worried in case your breathing difficulty is anxiety related. After her examinations, she concludes that your shortness of breath is actually a nut allergy. Similarly, when dealing with dementia, your doctor needs to figure out the underlying cause. And while Alzheimer's disease is the most common cause of dementia, it's not the only one. Dementia can also be caused by vascular changes in the brain, Parkinson's disease, Lewy body disease, vitamin deficiencies, thyroid gland problems, chronic brain infections, or medications. Even a very deep depression can sometimes look like dementia, which means if someone you love has dementia, it doesn't necessarily mean that they have Alzheimer's disease. And that's very important for your doctor to establish, because some causes of dementia, such as infection, medication reactions, an underactive thyroid gland, or vitamin deficiencies, can be reversible with the right treatment. So figuring out the cause and a plan of action could improve your quality of life. And that's why, if you or your loved one have the symptoms of dementia, you need to see your doctor to find out the underlying cause.
Okay, so this slide provides a great visual of dementia as the umbrella, with the specific types of dementias falling under that umbrella. Remember, dementia is not a disease in and of itself. It's a syndrome, a group of associated symptoms. And as we just saw in that video clip, there are many underlying diseases that are the culprit. We'll discuss the most common underlying causes in the next few slides. Alzheimer's disease is the most common form of dementia. In fact, it makes up 60 to 80% of all dementias. Typically, in Alzheimer's, recent memory is the first to go. You'll see language problems, the person misspeaks or misunderstands, increased impulsivity, and mistakes about time, place, and situations. And while every case is individual, Alzheimer's disease can last from a few years to nearly 20 years. Early onset, also known as younger onset, refers to cases that appear prior to the age of 65, and only 5 to 6% of cases fall into that early onset category. By the way, the only way to definitively diagnose Alzheimer's disease is by an autopsy. Traditional brain scans are used to rule out other possibilities, such as stroke or tumors. However, since the brains of many Alzheimer's patients contain beta amyloid, a physician may order a specialized procedure known as an amyloid scan to detect beta amyloid deposits in the brain. They may also order an examination of spinal fluid, as amyloid may also be detected in the spinal fluid. But most Alzheimer's diagnoses are based on cognitive and behavioral symptoms. Next, we'd like to share with you a 4-minute video from the National Institute of Health. The video provides us with some great visuals to help understand what goes on in the brain of a person living with Alzheimer's.
In healthy people, all sensations, movements, thoughts, memories, and feelings are the result of signals that pass through billions of nerve cells or neurons in the brain. Neurons constantly communicate with each other through electrical charges that travel down axons, causing the release of chemicals across tiny gaps to neighboring neurons. Other cells in the brain, such as astrocytes and microglia, clear away debris and help keep neurons healthy. In a person with Alzheimer's disease, the most basic form of dementia, toxic changes in the brain destroy this healthy balance. These changes may occur years, even decades, before the first signs of dementia. Researchers believe that this process involves 2 proteins, called beta amyloid and tau, which somehow become toxic to the brain. It appears that abnormal tau accumulates, eventually forming tangles inside neurons. And beta amyloid clumps into plaques, which slowly build up between neurons. As the level of amyloid reaches a tipping point, there is a rapid spread of tau throughout the brain. But tau and beta amyloid may not be the only factors involved in Alzheimer's. Other changes that affect the brain may also play a role over time. The vascular system may fail to deliver sufficient blood and nutrients to the brain. The brain may lack the glucose needed to power its activity. Chronic inflammation sets in as microglial cells fail to clear away debris, and astrocytes react to distressed microglia. Eventually, neurons lose their ability to communicate. As neurons die, the brain shrinks, beginning in the hippocampus, a part of the brain important to learning and memory. People may begin to experience memory loss, impaired decision-making, and language problems. As more neurons die throughout the brain, a person with Alzheimer's gradually loses the ability to think, remember, make decisions, and function independently. Achieving a deeper understanding of the molecular and cellular mechanisms and how they may interact is vital to the development of effective therapies. Much progress has been made in identifying various underlying factors. Advances in brain imaging allow us to see the course of plaques and tangles in the living brain. Blood and fluid biomarkers are providing insights about when the disease starts and how it progresses. More is also known about the genetic underpinnings of the disease and how they can affect particular biological pathways. These advances enable the development and testing of promising new therapies, including drugs that reduce or clear the increase of tau and amyloid proteins in the brain, therapies targeting the vascular system, glucose metabolism, and inflammation, and lifestyle interventions like exercise or diet. and behavioral approaches like social engagement that may enhance brain health. Research is moving quickly, ever closer to the day when we can delay or even prevent the devastation of dementia.
Okay, vascular dementia. Vascular disease is responsible for about 5 to 10% of the cases of dementia. It can result from either a major stroke or an accumulation of smaller strokes called TIAs. That stands for transient ischemic attacks. It's a mouthful, so TIA is good. All of these cardiovascular events result in restricted blood flow to the brain. And as we know, blood carries oxygen to all the cells in the body. And when the brain doesn't get oxygen, the cells die, and the brain and bodily functions are lost. The extent and type of damage depends on the severity of the stroke, what parts of the brain are impacted, and the number of previous strokes, whether they be major or the little ones, the TIAs. By the way, not all strokes result in dementia, but the more strokes that somebody has, the more likely they are to develop dementia. And even strokes that don't show any noticeable symptoms can also increase the risk. Now, sometimes symptoms of vascular dementia may sometimes be difficult to distinguish from Alzheimer's disease, but often brain scans can show if someone has had a stroke. Now, here's the main difference. Vascular dementia symptoms may appear suddenly, and after each little stroke, symptoms appear. Then they may seem to stabilize for short periods of time, and then they're going to deteriorate again after each subsequent stroke. So the prognosis for vascular dementia is generally very poor and very unpredictable. Many of the diseases that cause dementia progress in relatively predictable stages. This is especially true of Alzheimer's. However, as I just mentioned, vascular dementia is the least predictable because the loss of functioning is dependent upon what part of the brain has been impaired by a lack of oxygen. Okay, Gia, Lewy body. Gia, are you there?
It helps if I unmute. I'm talking away. Okay, sorry about that. Lewy body disease is an umbrella term that covers both Lewy body dementia and Parkinson's-related dementia. Lewy bodies are abnormal protein deposits in the brain that interfere with its functioning. Lewy body dementia causes symptoms similar to Alzheimer's, with fluctuating behavioral, memory, and motor problems. It's believed to be the second leading cause of dementia after Alzheimer's. Dementia with Lewy bodies, sometimes referred to as Lewy body dementia, typically begins with the symptoms of dementia, followed later on by motor issues. This dementia is characterized by visual hallucinations, typically non-threatening ones of children and animals. Lewy bodies are also responsible for the motor impairments that are typically associated with Parkinson's disease. And it's noteworthy that between 50 and 80% of those with a Parkinson's disease diagnosis will experience dementia, usually about 10 years after diagnosis. Whether Parkinson's dementia and dementia with Lewy bodies are distinct disorders or whether they represent different versions of the same disease is up for debate and further investigation.
Okay, frontotemporal disorders usually appear between the ages of 40 and 65, so younger. These disorders affect the frontal lobes of the brain, and that's the part of the brain that's responsible for executive functioning skills, such as reasoning, logic, problem solving, planning, managing emotional responses, and social judgment. Now, primary progressive aphasia is a result of malfunctioning in the temporal lobes, and that's where speech is produced and language is understood, including the ability to connect words with meanings and emotions. Now, at first, frontotemporal disorders may be misdiagnosed as a psychological problem because one of the first symptoms to appear is a drastic change in personality. And since these disorders tend to appear younger in life, again, between the ages of 40 and 65, we're not thinking dementia at that point. We're thinking, well, these people are too young, so something else must be going on. But you may have seen in the news recently that actor Bruce Willis was diagnosed with a frontotemporal disorder. Now, at first, his diagnosis was aphasia, but ultimately it was reported that he did have a frontotemporal dementia. And I think it's always a good thing when a celebrity is forthcoming with their diagnosis, as it can bring attention and hopefully even additional funding for research to diseases and disorders that affect many other people. Now, while frontotemporal disorders do have a strong genetic component, there is not one clear-cut genetic cause. However, many cases are said to be familial, meaning that they do run in families, just kind of like we see with Parkinson's and ALS. Now, a variety of factors can contribute to the development of frontotemporal disorders, but again, the most direct cause is a genetic variant that can be inherited from a parent and passed on to the kids. Mixed pathologies, also known as mixed dementias, refers to the case in which a person may simultaneously have more than one underlying condition or cause. The most common combination is Alzheimer's disease and vascular dementia. Now, mixed dementia symptoms are going to vary depending on, again, the brain regions that have been affected. Now, this condition is more common than previously thought. A recent autopsy study showed that more than 50% of those whose brains met the criteria for Alzheimer's also had evidence of one or more coexisting dementias. Now, we have just skimmed the surface about these common causes. We have lots of supplemental information for you about causes of dementia on our online resource list, and I encourage you to take a look. Now, I just wanted really to briefly mention some of the other possibilities, because it's estimated that over 100 diseases, disorders, and conditions can cause the symptoms of dementia. We just shared, the most common with you a moment ago, but here's a few more that you may have heard of. Huntington's disease, which is a genetic disease, Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, which is caused by a brain infection. Lately, we've heard lots of information about and cases of traumatic brain injuries, especially among football players and other athletes. These types of injuries are caused by a blow to the head. Now, not all TBIs result in dementia. Again, it just depends on the part of the brain that was damaged. There's something called alcohol-induced dementia, and this is usually a result of long-term drinking. Normal pressure hydrocephalus is a result of excess cerebrospinal fluid in the brain. The cause of this condition is unknown. It's also not uncommon for individuals with Down syndrome as they age to develop dementia. We tend to see dementia in the late stages of untreated HIV infection. Again, these are just a few of the possible underlying conditions that can cause dementia. So you may have seen graphics similar to this one that show what the human brain looks like as it's being destroyed by Alzheimer's and other related dementias. I just thought I'd put this up on the screen for a moment. These diagrams that I have up here represent a horizontal cross-section of the brain. And as you can see, ultimately, the person's brain is going to shrink to about 1/3 of what it was. And those places in the brain that have shrunk, there's holes in there, and those holes tend to fill up with fluid. All right,
As we've seen, there are many different, causes of dementia. There are certain factors that are specific to each cause, and each has its own trajectory and symptoms. But there are 4 undisputable truths of dementias. At least 2 parts of the brain are dying. Dementia is progressive, so the symptoms keep changing and getting worse. Dementia is chronic. It's not curable or fixable. And all dementias are terminal, ultimately resulting in death.
Okay, we talked about screening for dementia in our August class, so I'm going to be brief today. When a person starts exhibiting signs and symptoms, it's important to get a prompt and accurate diagnosis. Remember, we're looking for that underlying disease because if we know what the culprit is, we can look at possible treatments and behavioral and lifestyle interventions. It can also help the person and his or her family to plan for the future while the person is still able to make sound decisions. And by the way, the medications that are out there, it's not a one size fits all type of thing. You have to know, before we know what medications are going to work, we have to know what the specific cause of the dementia is. So a medical professional, usually the primary care doctor, a neurologist, or maybe a geriatrician, are going to conduct a thorough examination, including medical, surgical, and medication histories. The physician will perform a physical evaluation and check that there's no other health conditions that could be causing or contributing to the symptoms, such as signs of past strokes, Parkinson's, depression, or other medical conditions. Now, a question recently came up regarding who can request the cognitive screening. So I was asked this because apparently a physician told the family that they could not request the screening, that only the patient could. This is not accurate. Medicare has very specific guidelines for what physicians are supposed to screen for in the annual wellness visit. And one of those things that they're supposed to do is a quick cognitive functioning assessment. This is done routinely, or at least it's supposed to be. And also, the Medicare guidelines do state that the physician should consider the family's concerns. This doesn't violate the HIPAA privacy protocol. And if you need further info about this, please send me an email and I can send you some information. I don't have time to go into this in greater detail today. Now, during that appointment, the doctor will evaluate whether the patient has impaired memory or thinking skills and the degree of that impairment. Are there noticeable changes in personality or behavior? And importantly, how do any of these thinking problems affect the person's ability to function in daily life? If there are concerns, almost always someone who knows the patient well will be interviewed. So to determine a possible cause of the symptoms, doctors may order additional blood tests, brain imaging tests, or memory testing. And these tests can provide useful information for the diagnosis, including, as I mentioned a moment ago, ruling out other conditions that may cause similar symptoms. The testing also is important to establish a baseline about the degree of cognitive and functional degeneration. Now, tests administered to evaluate memory, judgment, and ability to understand information may include, and I've just listed a couple of the common ones here. There's one that's called the General Practitioner Assessment of Cognition. And this tool has been designed to be used by primary care physicians and family doctors. And it really doesn't require any training to administer it or to score it. The mini-cog is a 3-minute tool, and since it's not as comprehensive, further testing is almost always recommended. So if the physician thinks there is cause for further investigation, they may make a referral to a specialist. And then the last one I have listed here is one of the more precise screening tools and must be administered and scored by a healthcare professional who is trained and certified to do so. Now, there are many other screening tools out there, but these are among the most common.
we're going to share this video that is a Teepa Snow video. And for those of you who haven't heard of Teepa Snow before, she is one of the leading experts in dementia care. In this video, she's going to be discussing the brain changes that occur as a result of dementia.
So we know we have dementia. Let's talk about what's happening, what's going on in the brain when someone is living with these changes. And it's important to understand what's up there. What do you have in your brain and what's going on? Well, let's talk first about the job of the brain. The brain runs everything. It's really the guiding system, the maintenance system, the managing system. So in your brain, you have two major groupings. Deep in your brain, the limbic system. It's the first system to develop. It's the part of your brain that says, rum, rum. Infants have it. It's the thrive to survive. It's where all the core stuff is. Hunger, thirst, elimination, wake, sleep, temperature control, regulation, the ability to know whether or not you like something, don't like something, emotions, impulses, including the amygdala, which is part of this system. And it's a real important part because it's the part that allows you to recognize threats and that you need to do something. And it's flight, fright, fight. Fright is, the scary part. Flight is the get away from this. This is dangerous part. And fight is I want what I want and the drive towards something. So that's the core of your brain. That's preserved longest because it's developed first. And in most dementias, that's going to be the last thing to go. There'll be damage before there's destruction in that area. But this part of your brain, the surface of your brain called the cortex, it's the newer part. It's the part that develops later. And we're going to start off by talking about the part that really controls some of this and runs this, the front part. Now, the interesting thing is it's the last part of your brain to develop. The front part of your brain, called the frontal prefrontal, doesn't reach full maturity in males a little later than females, but until the late 20s, early 30s, mid 20s to late 20s. And what happens here is this drive, this center thing starts to be controlled. And the front part of your brain does three major things. Number one, it says, whoa, no, don't do that. That's going to get you in trouble. Or, you know what? The long range positive outweighs the temporary ugh. So it causes you to be able to delay gratification, to wait on something, to decide, okay, well, I'll wait instead of that's what I'm going to do. And it also gets you to pay attention to, is this going to get me what I want in the long run? So don't say that. That's mean. Don't do that. You'll lose your job. The second thing that the front part of your brain does and is really good at is getting you to think things through and make choices and decisions. And you can consider among all your options which one you're going to pick. Then the third thing it does, and this is the one that's last to develop, and to be honest, not everybody gets really good at it, it's this one, seeing things from another person's point of view, being able to actually not consider it just from where you're standing, but from where they're standing. So when you have dementia, the part you tend to keep really well is this part, that core part, that flight, fight, fright part, that I want what I want, and the emotions, not always like they were though, and not like you knew the person, because this part is the first part to be damaged in many, many types. So it means I'm having trouble with controlling my impulses. I'm doing things that don't seem right. I'm very impulsive, so I don't like what you're doing, and I let you know that in a nasty way, and I've done that. Or the second thing, I have trouble making decisions, or I make a decision and I go back and I'm not being logical and reasonable. And then it comes to seeing it from your point of view, and I simply can't. I don't understand even what you're talking about. It can be extreme in some dementias and minor in others, but ultimately that part of your brain, this part, is much more impaired than this part for a good part of the disease and from the very beginning. So now let's talk about the rest of this brain. And what's interesting is the whole rest of this brain is really based on getting information in so you can use it. So the rest of your brain is a sensory processing system. And in order to get the sensation in, you've got to pick it up. So we have 5 ways that you get information in your brain: what you see, what you hear, what you feel and do. Now that's a complicated one because there's two pieces to it. What you smell and what you taste. Now, the smell and the taste are actually primitive. They're pretty basic. They're not really high tech. And so where they go first is into this limbic system. But if you think about it, that's sort of important, because if something is not tasted good, you wouldn't eat it. And if it doesn't smell good, you want to get away from it. So it's interesting that that really is a part of the brain, believe it or not. Safety awareness in that area is dropping down from the very beginning, even though the rest of that is still working. So I want what I want, but I don't recognize danger anymore, even with these basics of smell and taste. So you might notice more interest in sugar and salt, less in nutritional. You might also notice that I love smells that I love, but I don't notice smells that bother you, like elimination smells and like urine and feces and body odor and spoiled food. I'm just not aware of that. So although this part is working, it's not right. And I don't use this to make it work right. The wiring's not right. Now, these three, what you see, what you hear, and what you feel and do, that's taken up a lot of brain space. So let's figure that out. Vision, back here in the back of your brain. And this thing called dementia really does mess with that. It changes it. You have two major kinds of vision, center field and edge vision. The center field vision is where you have curiosity and interest, where you figure things out. That tends to be pretty well preserved. But the edge vision, paying attention to the edges, safety awareness, just not there. So what does that mean? What it means is I become less and less able to pick up on the edges of my visual field. I become more and more focused. My world is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And even in the early stages of the disease, I can go from a visual field like this to a visual field like this. But if you don't know that, as somebody who's in my life, you touch me on the shoulder and lean around, and suddenly I think you're attacking me, and I react strongly to that. As the disease moves into the mid stages, which is approximately when most people recognize it as what it is, my visual field is closing down into binoculars. I have about this much of the world I can see at a time. And what that means is I miss lots of detail. Particularly, I can look out or I can look down and pay attention here, but I can't do both at the same time. Because you, as my care person, may not know that. You might really surprise me. And that's not necessarily a good thing. I surprise myself sometimes by missing details because I also can't scan in an organized fashion. I can't remember where I last looked to know where to look next. And so I lose things. And then I think people have moved things. And it gets really distressing for me to figure this out. Then as the disease moves further, I can't take in images through each eye, flip them around, line them up in the back of my brain so I can see in 3D. So my brain has to decide double vision or just use one, but lose depth. And when you lose depth, suddenly simple things become very difficult because I can't judge distance to objects. I can't tell whether it's 2D or 3D. Is that an apple or a picture of an apple? And so you might see me do what seem to be very odd things where I'm trying to pick patterns off of the carpet, or I'm running my hands along the edge, or I miss the whole table when I set something down. It's not that I'm not trying, it's that I'm not getting data in and processing it like I should. And then we get to this one, auditory processing. Now, I hear things, and you hear with your ears, but you process right above that, the temporal lobes. The interesting thing in the human brain is one side is not the same as the other. So for 98% of human beings, the left side of your brain is where you have formal language skills, vocabulary, comprehension, speech production. The right is where you have basic rhythm type skills +1. Most dementias attack asymmetrically, and what they do is they attack the left more than the right. So you lose on the left, but you maintain or keep or retain on the right. What that means is you're losing your vocabulary, and it starts with nouns, comprehension. Early on, you may be losing 1 out of 4 words in a sentence, and the ability to actually produce the speech and the words in the particular format that you meant to deliver them. What you're keeping, automatic social chit chat, which makes it seem like you're much more processing than you are. You're actually getting more than you are because you chit chat with people back and forth. The second thing is you can both deliver and get the rhythm of speech. Third thing is that you have music, poetry, and prayer. Now, that's a gift because you can do those things. You can sing when you can't talk anymore very frequently because that's preserved. And you learn the music as a song and it's there. You can also move rhythmically. That means you can dance and clap and you can move automatically better than you can plan a movement out, because that requires thinking skills that just won't come together for you. Now, the last skill you keep on this side are your forbidden words. They're stored over there from a very young age, and they are swear words, sex talk, racial slur, and ugly words. And suddenly you're saying things you shouldn't to people you shouldn't say them to, and you never did stuff like that before. Don't blame the person. They're doing the best they can when you're the care partner. The challenge is letting that go, because it just happens to be a preserved skill, something they're good at. Sorry, it's how it is. Now, let's go to this last part, and this takes up a huge amount of real estate up here. What this is your ability to feel things all over your body and then do something about it, to do something and then to realize what it feels like. And just keeping in mind that safety awareness versus skill and curiosity. I keep curiosity, but I'm not as safety aware. So temperatures, textures, I might touch something and be curious, but I'm not as good at picking up on things. So my safety becomes an issue fairly quickly, and I don't necessarily know that. So you have a map of your entire body up here for sensation in, movement out. And this disease, even though that isn't necessarily where it starts with many dementias, will eventually involve these areas. It's estimated with most dementias, you're going to go from a full-size brain to one that is 1/3 its original size. So you go from this to this. And quite frankly, it's amazing that the person with dementia can do what they do. But the other piece of the puzzle is to realize it's not just about these structural changes. Your brain has chemistry, and the chemistry changes second to second, even shorter times than that, sending impulses in your brain. But the problem is the chemistry is changing too. So what I could do 5 minutes ago, I may not be able to do right now because I just don't have the chemistry. So brain changes in dementia. Does it matter? Do you need to know this stuff? You better believe it. And the problem is, when you hear the word dementia, typically you're still just thinking about memory problems. Well, working memory involves all of this stuff. And so you can imagine it's changing. But when we talk about long-term memory and emotional memory, that is actually stored in your brain. Tip it up, drive it in to the hippocampal area. New learning, holding on to new things, and remembering old stuff, it's all in there. The problem is, with some dementias, you lose one and not the other. So I'm very good at old stuff, but not new stuff. And in other cases, I have trouble with both. But what I tend to keep is emotional memory. Now that's a bit of a problem because I remember that I'm mad at you, but I don't know why. So chemically and structurally, the person is changing. You can choose what you do. They don't get a choice. It's happening. So once you understand that about brain change, about dementia, suddenly, aha, the front of your brain activates. You have choices, decisions to make, things to do differently. And when you do that, you make choices that change everything for both of you.
So, as we learned, when people think about what dementia is, they typically think of it as something that robs someone of their memory, or something that causes people to behave out of character. And both of those two characterizations are true. However, because dementia is a condition that causes the brain to deteriorate, its impact is far greater than just memory decline or atypical behaviors. Nearly every aspect of brain functioning is ultimately impacted by this degenerative syndrome. As we know, our brains are responsible for every bodily function. Memory and language do tend to be the abilities that are hit first and hardest, but in addition to memory and language, dementia impacts all of these other brain abilities: vision, perception, motor skills, both fine and large motor skills, reasoning, judgment, abstract thinking, and our attention. In our remaining time today, we're going to look at each of these brain changes to give you a better understanding of how they impact those living with dementia.
Okay, So Gia just gave you this long list of regions of the brain, brain functions that are impacted by dementia. And today we're really going to focus on memory, communication skills, vision, and perception. But I did want to hit some of the other areas. So let's just take a real quick look at some of the other abilities that are also affected by dementia. Now, motor skills include both our small and large muscles. The person may develop dexterity issues, difficulty using utensils, working zippers, buttons, shaving, even writing. Now, note also, though, that dexterity issues may also be compounded by age-related arthritis. Chewing and swallowing issues tend to appear more as the dementia has progressed to late and end stages. Now, individuals may have trouble with balance and coordination, making falls a much greater concern. And as you may notice, sometimes people with dementia kind of shuffle a bit when they walk. Now, of course, the natural aging process affects all of these, but with dementia, it tends to be more significant. With regard to reasoning and judgment impairments, persons with dementia have difficulty understanding cause and effect and complicated explanations. They struggle with simple problem solving. They may be unable to understand another person's point of view. They are always right and we are always wrong. And as care partners, we just need to accept that and try not to argue or convince. And we'll talk a lot more about that in our December webinar. They may be unable to separate important from unimportant facts and details. Now, dementia impairs decision-making, especially in new situations and those involving personal safety, such as cooking and driving. The individuals may become more susceptible to scammers. Sadly, the elderly in general seem to be targets for this. So an example, my mother-in-law was beginning to develop symptoms of dementia while she still lived at home. And one morning she received a phone call from a young man posing as her grandson. And he said something like, "Grandma, I'm in trouble. I'm in jail in Mexico, and they won't let me out unless you go to the bank right now and wire them $5,000. You've probably heard this scam before. Now, mother-in-law was frantic. It didn't occur to her, though, that she had just seen her grandson within the hour. So she grabs her purse, heads down the street to the bank. Now, fortunately, another family member happened to see her walking down the street and stopped her. Dementia had impaired not only her decision-making and problem-solving ability, but it had also distorted her sense of time. Now, some people behave in socially inappropriate ways due to a diminished social filter and a lack of impulse control. There's a loss of inhibitions, and sometimes, as Teepa mentioned, we hear a lot of sex talk, even if they were previously very proper. This is particularly hard for family members to handle because it can be really embarrassing. My friend Linda's 90-year-old mom used to make lewd comments to my husband. Linda was mortified. And by the way, so was my husband. However, we all came to realize that the comments were actually harmless. And being around my husband actually made her mom really happy. Somehow, it just kind of made her feel comforted and socially connected. Abstract thinking involves our highest level of cognitive abilities and thought processing. These abilities, along with judgment and reasoning, these are all located in our frontal lobes. And as Teepa mentioned, this is one of the last areas of the brain to be fully developed, and usually not until early adulthood. And interestingly, as again, Teepa mentioned, it's one of the first areas to be attacked by dementia. The person with dementia may struggle with concepts of time and money. They may no longer be able to manage their own finances. They need specific, concrete examples and instructions. Sarcasm and irony may be confusing for them. But remember, everybody is different. My aunt couldn't remember her family members, and she repeated the same questions literally every couple of minutes. But she was very quick-witted and had a sharp sense of humor. And she was able to understand sarcasm and actually even use it appropriately. She loved to tease. She loved to be teased. Very unusual. And remember too, that that's not true for everybody. Most people with dementia will take what you say quite literally, and they can have their feelings hurt pretty easily. And then attention refers to our ability to focus, to pay attention, to stay on task, to multitask. Those with dementia may become easily distracted. This can impact their ability to complete tasks, even very familiar ones, like following a favorite recipe. They may become overwhelmed and overstimulated in large groups or noisy environments, and this usually causes them to withdraw. This is because they have difficulty sorting out important information from the background noise. Okay, so this is a lot, and for many of us, it's really scary. I read somewhere that when Americans were surveyed about dreaded diseases, they were more frightened about getting dementia than they were about cancer. I can totally understand that. So now let's take a look at one of dementia's biggies, memory. Although memories are stored all over the brain, the hippocampus is the brain structure that's primarily responsible for facilitating memory processing and storage. Now, the hippocampus is part of the limbic system, or the core of our primitive brain that Teepa was mentioning. Now, the hippocampus is kind of like the brain's librarian, taking in information, deciding how important it is, and then cataloging and storing it in the appropriate place. And unfortunately, this brain structure tends to be hit first and hardest by dementia, especially those dementias that are caused by Alzheimer's and stroke. Now, we all know that persons with dementia have difficulty learning and remembering new information. So why is this? If the hippocampus, which is responsible again for processing information, has been damaged and has lost its ability to convert or change working or short-term memory into long-term memory, then it can no longer store that information for more than a few minutes, or in some cases, for a few seconds. Hence, the person will ask the same questions over and over. They can't follow instructions because they can't remember them. Or in some cases, they can't remember whether they've just eaten a meal. But some seem to remember, sometimes in great detail, information from the past. Long-term memory tends to be the least subject to decay, possibly because it's been there the longest and rehearsed the most. Also, we know that memories are stored all over the brain, and many very significant memories that are attached to emotions may be stored in the emotional center of the brain, the amygdala, which remains until the very end. My father-in-law had Alzheimer's disease, nearly 20 years. In the last few years of his life, he could no longer remember that he had a son. In his mind, he was in his early 20s and in the army, but he still felt a really strong emotional connection to his son, my husband. Those emotions never fade, even until the very end. So my father-in-law thought that my husband was his brother, another younger man with whom he had that strong emotional connection. That made perfect sense to him. And we learned never to correct him because it just confused him. So those with dementia may not remember who you are or even what your name is, but that emotional connection will always remain. And that's what we as family members and friends really need to hold on to. Confabulation refers to making up stuff without a conscious intent to deceive. Do you ever wonder where all of those outrageous stories come from? The person with dementia fills in the holes in their memory with what makes sense to them at the time. And since they've most likely lost their ability to think rationally, we won't be able to use logic to convince them that they're wrong. It's pointless to even try. So my mom's vascular dementia was caused by a series of mini strokes. And towards the end of her life, she lived in a skilled nursing facility. My mom wore false teeth, actually kind of one of those partial plates that she would take out at night. She was always misplacing her teeth because she'd put them somewhere, but since her working memory didn't get converted into long-term memory and stored, she had no recollection of where she put her teeth. So of course, when she couldn't find them, it made sense to her that somebody had stolen them. And I couldn't use logic to explain to her that her teeth would be of no use to anyone else and that the nurses weren't stealing them. The explanation that made perfect sense to her was that the nurses were stealing her false teeth and selling them for parts. So when the teeth would turn up in odd locations, my mom accused the nurses of hiding them from her. Now, before dementia, my mom was a highly competent, independent woman. She was a World War II veteran, an ER charge nurse, and a single mom. And in her mind, nothing had changed. So the only logical reason, again to her, that her teeth would turn up in a bag of Halloween candy would be that someone was messing with her. She was protecting her ego. And I finally learned to let her, because I didn't need to be right. But my mom needed to feel like she was still competent. Our concepts of time, space, and directionality are controlled by the hippocampus. And when the hippocampus is damaged, we become disoriented, even to the point of time traveling. Remember my father-in-law who thought that he was 20 in the Army? Well, he came to believe that he was still living in Hawaii, not in the nursing home in Livermore. There were actually palm trees surrounding his nursing home, so it made perfect sense to him. And if he thought that he was in Hawaii instead of a nursing home, we're not going to argue with that. When people with dementia are still driving, oh my gosh, not only do they get lost because they can't remember the name of their street or their house number or how they ended up somewhere, but their sense of directionality is impacted. We all have these cognitive maps stored in our brain that help us to navigate familiar places almost automatically. Now, these cognitive maps get destroyed and distorted by dementia. So if you combine that loss of directionality, impaired vision, memory loss, inability to problem solve and make quick judgments, and a lack of safety awareness, all things necessary for driving, you can see why it is so dangerous for all of us to allow someone with dementia to continue driving.
The limbic system is a collection of structures involved in processing emotion and memory. Included in these structures are the hippocampus and the amygdala. The amygdala is where emotions are given meaning, remembered and attached to associations and responses, otherwise known as emotional memories. And the amygdala is present and functioning from birth. A good example of the amygdala's role is that it's part of the brain's, and we've been mentioning it a lot today, portion of the brain that drives the fight or flight reflexive response. The amygdala helps us coordinate our response to our environment. Now, the hippocampus is responsible for processing long-term memory and emotional responses. For example, we wouldn't be able to remember where our house is or that we have emotional attachments to it without the work of the hippocampus. Since emotions remain intact, it's important to consider the importance of the emotional exchange that you have with the person who's living with dementia. That fight, flight, reflexive response is a physiological reaction that occurs in response to a perceived threat. And that threat can be either physical or emotional. This is an automatic response, and it sticks around long into the disease. Vision involves interpretation of visual stimuli. So it's the eye, or the retina, and brain working together. Many elderly persons experience vision problems such as macular degeneration, cataracts, and glaucoma. these can all be made worse by dementia. Dementia causes one's field of vision to narrow. There is a loss of peripheral vision, and often we see only what our brain thinks that we need to see. For example, only that which is right in front of us. The brain shuts down many processing abilities in order to accommodate what is most needed. So what's right in front of us is what's easiest to readily see and interpret. Because of this, we lose safety awareness. In mild or early stage dementia, your vision feels as if you're looking through a scuba mask, like a scuba diver's mask. In middle stage, it's as if someone is looking through binoculars, or sometimes I like to say swim goggles. Late stage dementia is when one eye is if you're looking through a telescope and the other eye is completely blacked out. So for example, monocular vision reduces depth perception. A patient may reach toward the ceiling to turn off a light and not realize that the light is 4 feet away. It may seem like he or she is picking at thin air. Emotionally, this can result in anxiety, fear, and perhaps even anger and aggression. Teepa Snow has another really great video that provides a good demonstration of this. So let's look.
So with this disease, we know that with your 5 senses, you're going to change in your visual abilities, your auditory processing abilities, but not your ability to hear sound, your sensation and your movement, what you feel and what you do, what you smell, and then what you taste. All of those are going to change, and you lose safety awareness before you lose curiosity. With vision, your field is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. It's particularly important for us to recognize when a person's in early stages of dementia, they're a diamond. And in other words, these are Allen levels. And what we're talking about here is they have vision that's like a scuba mask. They've lost the sides and the top, but the center's pretty good. When they go from that to having binoculars, there's a real important difference, because when you have a scuba mask, what you're going to be able to do is see the plate in front of you and the person across the table. Once you develop binocular vision, you can either look across the table or look at the plate down in front of you, but you can't do both at the same time. It's one or the other. You have social vision or you have a task vision. And every time you switch, you have to readjust everything. So if I'm looking and talking at you, I don't realize something's going on right here. And if I'm looking down like this, I don't realize there's anything out there. And after that, it gets even worse, because now I look at objects and I don't know how to use them. I don't know what they're for. I see it, but I have a hard time identifying what it is and then what you do with it. So I have apraxia. And then I have to figure out, now, how do I get started with this? I have to remember the sequence in the organization. So I pick this thing up and I may know it's a fork, but then how do you use a fork? How do you hold a fork? How do you manipulate a fork? And how do you pick things up? And which things do you use a fork for and which do you use a spoon for? It gets complicated. And then comes the time when I can't get my 2 images to line up. And my brain decides, well, okay, we'll just pay attention to one. So I become monocular and I lose all depth perception. And it's amazing how quickly you can get yourself into trouble, because when you have just one eye looking about, if you were to do this, look at your index finger and then track your index finger down to touch something on the floor. What you're going to realize is you don't have a sense of how far away that is. And if you're relying on your feet and your legs and the muscles to organize things, they get tricked, because what they're relying on is the visual information to make adjustments, which means you're very at risk for falls.
Okay, so Teepa talked about perception there. So let's go into that in a little bit more detail. So first of all, sensation and perception go hand in hand. You can't have one without the other. Sensation is all about our ability to take in physical stimuli from our environments, light waves, sound waves, pressure, microscopic bits of chemical matter that activate our senses of taste and smell. Perception is our ability to interpret those sensations, to figure out what they are and to react accordingly. Perception involves higher level thinking skills, the type of frontal lobe skills that tend to be impacted first by dementia. So we interpret based not only on that physical or chemical stimulus, but on our experience and our expectations. So memory also plays a role, as do logic and drawing conclusions. And when those higher level cognitive abilities are damaged, we experience distortions in perception. We may no longer be able to tell the difference between two stimuli, especially when the stimuli are similar. For example, a screeching bird outside may be misperceived as a child in distress. Evening shadows may be misperceived as an intruder lurking outside. And this can become even more problematic if the person is also experiencing paranoia, which is pretty common in dementia. A person with dementia may not be able to detect a white toilet against a white wall in the bathroom, and may instead urinate into a nearby wastebasket or other container. It makes sense to him. He sees an oval container and he thinks it's the toilet. Or if you serve mashed potatoes on a white plate, the person with dementia may not be able to detect that there's food on the plate and feed themselves. A dark throw rug or a shadow on the floor may appear to be a hole in the floor, and the person may refuse to walk there for fear of falling into that hole. So when a person with dementia appears to be hallucinating, seeing, hearing, feeling things that are not really there, or having delusions, which are persistent false beliefs. Remember, paranoia is the most common delusion. As their care partners, we need to first determine, is this really a hallucination, or can it be a misperception? Now, a person with dementia can certainly hallucinate or experience delusions. But before we come to that conclusion, we first need to rule out issues with perception that we may be able to mitigate by changing the environment, like moving that dark throw rug or painting the bathroom a different color so that the toilet stands out. And Gia mentioned earlier with Lewy body dementia, one of the very first symptoms is that people do tend to have hallucinations. They're usually not scary ones. They're frequently of children or animals. Okay, now the brain has areas of specialization, and all of these specialized parts work together as an integrated unit. Our brain is also divided into hemispheres or halves, right and left. Again, each with their area of specialization. Now remember from the TIPA video that we just watched, the left hemisphere is responsible for most of our language functions, vocabulary, comprehension, and speech production. Dementia attacks the brain asymmetrically, and unfortunately, it's the left hemisphere that tends to be greatly impacted. Thus, important communication abilities do tend to be lost. In the early stage of dementia, an individual misses, or in other words, doesn't comprehend, about 25% of spoken language. This is not due to a hearing loss. It's due to a loss of understanding. And as dementia progresses, that percentage of loss increases. Nouns tend to be lost first. Hence, the person will substitute thingy or that thing for words that they just can't recall. If they can't recall the precise term, they tend to describe the object. That thing over there that turns on the TV, or that clock on my hand. So we're seeing a decrease in vocabulary and over-reliance on common and familiar words. Their speech may be disorganized, and they may easily lose their train of thought. There's a tendency to kind of talk around a topic and struggle getting to the point. That's really hard for us as care partners. It's hard to be patient, but we have to try to understand that it's even harder for them. It's not uncommon for someone who is not a native speaker to revert to using and only understanding their first language. One of the women in my caregiver support group shared with us recently that her husband, who's not a native speaker, yet was fluent in English, no longer understands English. And that created quite a problem recently when he spent a couple of weeks in a skilled nursing facility. He was so distressed when she wasn't there to serve as his interpreter. And then, of course, there's more of a reliance on gestures to express needs and wants. It's important for us to remember to use gestures and facial expressions as well to help people with dementia better understand our meaning. Now, unfortunately, these days we're seeing a lot of mask wearing, and that does interfere with communication, especially if the person is hard of hearing and is used to reading lips and facial expressions. So this is where we as caregivers, need to get creative, resourceful. I always carried a little whiteboard and marker with me when I visited my aunt. She was really very hearing impaired. And thank goodness, though, that her eyesight was good and she was still able to read actually up until the very end. And probably the most devastating effect of language loss is the resulting isolation. Language is the expression of our needs, our wants, our knowledge, our emotions. It's about the exchange of thoughts and information. And it's the basis of all relationships. When one can no longer communicate, others are uncomfortable being around them. They don't know what to do or say. They tend to stay away. So we often hear things like, why should I talk to grandma? She doesn't even know who I am. And she asks me the same questions over and over. I don't even know what to talk about with her. And the person with dementia senses this discomfort and becomes less likely to want to interact with others. So that vicious cycle begins. And we'll talk more about this in our December webinar. We know that isolation leads to depression and ultimately a weakening of the immune system, making us more susceptible to infections like pneumonia, the flu, COVID. Isolation also leads to a more rapid decline of abilities in the person with dementia. However, all is not lost because there's still the good old right hemisphere.
The right side of the brain. So the right side of the brain controls emotional and intuitive thought, the ability to respond to music and rhythm, and our impulse control or filter. This hemisphere tends not to be as impacted by dementia, or at least not until very late into the disease. We retain long-term memories, rhythm, and things tied to emotion here. When we say rhythm, we're not just talking about music, but also the rhythm of speech, poetry and prayer, for example. A story that I like to tell is about a patient I was visiting who was described as primarily nonverbal. She didn't verbally respond to caregivers' attempts to help or engage. One day, I found her sitting in a recliner with her head down. She didn't respond to the sound of my voice when I introduced myself, nor did she respond when I gently put my hand on her shoulder. So I sat down on the floor in front of her recliner and tried to make eye contact with her by putting myself in her field of vision. She made eye contact with me for a split second, but then dropped her eyes again. Now, anyone who knows me knows that I am not a singer. However, I decided to try what I knew of retained rhythm and the dementia brain. I took a deep breath, more for bravery than for air, and started singing Jingle Bells. To my delight and surprise, she started to sing along with me. She sang every word with me, including dashing through the snow. It was wonderful. Additionally, she smiled while we sang. We continued on with about 2 more Christmas songs before she began to disengage, but we successfully shared a good 5 to 7 minutes of a connection, and she had a few moments of joy. Every little bit helps. Now, unfortunately, forbidden words like swear words, racial slurs, and sex talk, basically anything that's inappropriate to use, especially in public, are retained. What isn't retained is the use of a filter to know when not to say it. Debbie mentioned earlier how embarrassed everyone was when her friend's mom was flirting with Debbie's husband. There's not a lot we can do about this except try and provide a distraction when it happens, and to later help others understand to try and not take it personally. The stages of dementia give us a general idea of where someone is in the disease process. And most models focus on what the person living with dementia can't do. I believe this approach is informational, but inherently flawed. And here's why. By focusing on loss, you're missing out on other opportunities. It's not just about the loss. By focusing on what skills are left, we can provide better quality of life and more person-centered care. Teepa Snow has created a model called the GEMS states. This is a wonderful model that looks at people as precious gems and focuses on providing the appropriate setting and care for persons living with dementia. However, the following three models are the scales that medical professionals most commonly refer to. As you can see in this slide, the Alzheimer's Association's model breaks the stages up into three parts: early, middle, and late. The Global Deterioration Scale, or GDS, has a 7-stage model, with 1 being little to no dementia symptoms and 7 being severe dementia symptoms. It's important to note that the GDS model works best with Alzheimer's disease, but not so much with vascular dementia, Lewy body dementia, and frontotemporal dementias, because it reflects with the losses and compares very much to the way we develop in infancy, childhood, and adulthood, just deterioration instead of growth. So opposite. There's even another stage model related to cognitive issues called the Allen Cognitive Levels Model. In my opinion, this is actually a better model than the previous two in that it focuses on more than just loss. It helps us to see what people still might be interested in doing, what they still might be able to do, and how care partners can best support them. Unfortunately, this numbered scale is opposite the Global Deterioration Scale, in as level 6 equates to normal cognitive abilities, and level 1 is where the person living with dementia needs 24-hour, 7-day-a-week care. It's really confusing. And when we're not all on the same page with which scale we're working with, it gets even worse. Let's go into a little more detail about the Alzheimer's Association model, as that's the one that tends to be most widely used. And by the way, one of our handouts outlines these and tells you what the caregiver's responsibilities are at each stage. So quickly, before we take a look at early stage dementia, I'd like to say a word about mild cognitive impairment, or MCI. We talked about MCI in great detail in our last presentation that, again, can be found on the Hope Hospice website. MCI refers to cognitive changes that are serious enough for the person and their family to notice, but don't really affect the person's ability to carry out everyday activities. Mild cognitive impairment is simply a diagnosis representing a doctor's best professional judgment about the reason for a person's symptoms. It's estimated that about 15 to 20% of individuals over the age of 65 have MCI. MCI does not always lead to dementia. However, having MCI makes one more likely to develop Alzheimer's. It's important to note that each person living with dementia reacts individually to some degree, but these are some of the more common signs and characteristics. Someone in the early stages of dementia can usually still perform routine tasks. They may have some memory loss that disrupts daily life, like forgetting a word or misplacing items. Sequencing may become an issue, and this may show up when trying to accomplish multiple tasks or planning something that requires seeing the big picture. Family and close friends may start to notice that something is off, but not be able to clearly pinpoint it. At this stage, one is still mostly able to understand what changes are occurring. Caregiving is much more challenging in this stage, the middle stage, most often when a diagnosis is made. It's a very stressful time for all involved. At mid-stage dementia, brain function deterioration is pretty apparent. A person may be able to understand that you want them to do something, but not understand what it is that you want them to do, or maybe even how to do it. Visual cues become much more important at this point, and reducing the number of words you use with them can aid in there being less confusion. A person may still be able to go out for walks, say to a familiar park, but they may become confused and not know how to get home. In late stage dementia, we often see a decrease in the ability to respond to other people, situations, and what's going on in the environment. At this point, a person may not be able to express their wants, needs, and/or their frustrations verbally. You may see them become more agitated, aggressive, and withdrawn. This is actually them trying to communicate their feelings and their needs to you. It's our job as care partners to put on our detective hats and try and figure out what needs aren't being met that are causing them to act in the way that they are. Physically, they are no longer safe doing much on their own, including eating. End-stage dementia. Sensory connections often remain at this stage, so facial communication and emotions are still really important. It's important to remember to try and accept the person living with dementia where they are. You may not see any signs that they're emotionally responding to seeing you, your touch, or your voice, but know that your presence is reassuring. There is a handout that will be posted when we post this webinar online that lists all of these stages and things that a care partner can do and should focus on. There are a lot of things you can do and steps you can take. So let's talk about Teepa Snow's GEM states. The model that I mentioned earlier is my favorite one. The thought process behind Teepa Snow's GEMS is that she wanted to come up with a simple way for us to focus on what abilities remain and for care partners to figure out ways to best support and encourage those abilities. Part of the definition of a gem is of something precious and prized for its uniqueness and great beauty. By assigning each of these stages or abilities to a precious gem, we've created an image of appreciation for the retained abilities a person living with dementia has. There are 6 GEMS levels: sapphire, diamond, emerald, amber, ruby, and pearl. And it's important to note that it's entirely possible for a person to be considered one gem one day and a completely different gem the next day. A person living with dementia could also be displaying the characteristics of 2 different gems at the same time. The important takeaway here is that we're using this model to help support in a way that will foster engagement and participation rather than isolation and dysfunction. That all being said, being mindful of our limited time today, I really can't go into more detail about the GEM state model. However, we are working on a webinar later on next year that is dedicated to presenting just about the GEMs. Incidentally, there's also an app that you can get on your phone from Teepa Snow, free of charge, that talks about the GEM states. It's really neat because you can identify a particular GEM state and then dig a little deeper to see suggested ways of helping to connect with that person or helpful hints on how to support that person. And an important side note, if there ever seems to be a very sudden change in any model levels, a medical team should always be notified, as it can sometimes signal that something else is going on. For example, a urinary tract infection, or maybe pain that the person isn't able to express to us.
Okay, so that's it for Dementia Basics. We know that we've given you a lot of information today, went a little bit over time, but remember that you do have access to the slides as well as to a lot of other resources that we've provided for you. As we keep talking about, this webinar is going to be posted on our website should you want to watch it again or share it with others.